Hello, this is Mr. Ferreira, and I'm going to be talking you through Milgram on obedience. Now, I know we go into a lot of detail looking at Milgram. It's because it's a fascinating experiment and certainly epitomizes the whole social influence topic for psychology A level. But for us, we need to keep an eye on the specification, and what the specification does ask us to do is to look at explanations for obedience. But it says, as investigated by Milgram. And so therefore, what I'm going to suggest is that if we have a really good understanding of Milgram, then of course we can understand what agentic state means and what legitimate authority means, and of course the variables will kind of come with it. Now, before we move on to that, we need to look at kind of what obedience is. Now, this is only because some people do, for some reason, kind of interchange and use conformity when they mean obedience. And I just want to kind of make it a little bit clear to you. But of course, the difference really is that it is a form of social influence, as we did find for conformity, but it's about this direct order. So in other words, an authority figure telling you to do something that you would not otherwise have done before. So therefore, this is not about me doing what I want to do. It's not about doing kind of what I would normally do. It's about me doing something that I wouldn't normally do. So therefore, when we look at Milgram and we see that he is setting this up in a very similar way to what Ash would have done, because he was a student of Ash, talking about this idea of an unjust command, kind of to do something that is disproportionate, that's inappropriate, that you shouldn't be doing to a potential innocent person. Now, he published this research in 1963. There's lots of different variations as part of this particular work. He was given some funding, military funding, to do the research, but we focus on a specific variation, and I'm led to believe that's variation number 6. And that's the variation that we watched in terms of the video, which was called How Violent Are We? And hopefully I'll be able to put that up onto the Google Drive for you to watch if you haven't already seen it. Like many of the experimenters at the time, he would have just advertised for participants, and he put a flyer out there. But I suppose what is really important is that this kind of middle kind of aspect of this: no special training, education, or experience is needed. And if you kind of read into Milgram's kind of background and ideas of kind of what he's looking for, it is likely that he wanted to kind of have men that were of a similar age and would have been kind of similar to the prison guards that would have been at the concentration camps. Milgram is a Jew, and there is kind of a lot of evidence potentially that he wants to kind of show that Americans and Germans would kind of behave differently under different circumstances. But we'll see as this experiment unfolds that that's not necessarily the case. Now, of course, this is slightly out of date, but back in the day, in 2015, I worked out that's about £20. This is for an hour of your time, and of course, people may well be interested in doing this. We also know that they were given a bit of money for their bus fare home. We know that he was able to recruit 40 participants to do this particular variation, and that they did have a range of ages and a range of skills, kind of to represent the people that he wanted for this particular experiment. We also know that when they get there, they are met by an experimenter who kind of explains to them that they are doing an experiment based on how punishment affects learning. And they were given $4.50. And we see from the next slide that they were told at this particular stage that they could withdraw at any particular time without forfeiting the money. Now, of course, this kind of all goes together. Very difficult to do social influence research if you don't deceive your participants. I don't think it's a major issue, but of course, it does mean that we're going to have this issue later called informed consent. We also know at this particular stage that being told that they can leave without forfeiting money is really, really important. But of course, we can see that they were never reminded of that particular fact later on in the particular situation. We know that there were 3 main players in this particular experiment, the first one being the participant, but then there were 2 confederates. One Confederate was the experimenter, and for the life of me, I never remember his name anyway. And he is this person wearing a grey lab coat. He is a tall figure and quite imposing. And from what I've read, he was a former kind of science teacher. The other one is Mr. Wallace, probably better known because he's the victim. And I think a lovely description of him was that he was pathetic enough. Now, of course, that goes back to this idea of kind of shocking somebody that's kind of unjust, somebody who's innocent. And so he kind of had to be innocent enough for Milgram to kind of make a judgment as to whether the person was going to be obedient or not. We then have a rigged draw. Now this is very easy to do. You just have two pieces of paper, both of which say teacher on it. And of course, you just simply ask Mr. Wallace what's on his piece of paper, and he says learner. And of course, the other person's not going to say, oh, really? Let me have a look. Because what he sees on his piece of paper is that he's going to be the teacher. So the participant is always the teacher. Now, it takes place at a lovely university, and we see that there's these kind of lovely red brick buildings. It's quite an important place. It's similar to one of the Oxbridge universities that we have over here. And of course, we know that the experimenter is kind of showing all the symbols of authority kind of by wearing a lab coat. We're then introduced to the scenario where we take the fake learner into a room. We have a partition between the two, and the experimenter calls the teacher in to kind of see the person being strapped into the chair. And at this stage, I would recommend that you look at some of the original black and white footage on Milgram. You kind of see this whole procedure kind of really clearly, and we see kind of what's happening. We also learn a bit about exactly what they're going to be doing is remembering word pairs, and that if the student gets it wrong, we see that they're going to be given a shock of 15 volts. But of course, what we also see this impressive shock machine that kind of goes up in 15 increments all the way up to 450, where it says kind of severe shock, XXX danger, things like that. I kind of get you to kind of just count this through. How many shocks is that really going to be? Because that's kind of an important aspect of this particular experiment. It wasn't that the participants were asked to shock once or twice. They were actually asked to shock a number of times. I'm not going to count all the way through, but you can certainly see there's a lot going to this. So shocking at 15, 30, 45, 60, 75, 90, 105. Okay, so I've already got to 7 shocks and I'm at 105. So we're looking at kind of over 20, 24 shocks or so given to the person in order to get all the way to 450 volts. But then the next kind of part of the Milgram study is really important. He kind of made it very clear, is the person obedient or not? Okay, so if they are obedient, they shock all the way to 450 volts. And you see from the black and white footage that the experimenter often required them to shock 450 volts more than once in order to ascertain that it was genuinely obedience. We also know that before they start the questioning, that they get strapped or they get an electrode put onto them, and they're given a real shock of 45 volts. This is also kind of an interesting kind of element of the experiment, because the person may not know what electric household kind of voltage is. They also may not have a conceptual idea what 450 volts really is. They've seen kind of danger, XXX, things like that. But they could probably kind of figure out from their own shock of 45 volts how painful that was, kind of how kind of 10 times more volts would be even more painful or even more disastrous for the victim. We also know that in the process of being strapped into the machine, the learner does kind of express heart trouble, and this is specific and also kind of adds to the whole kind of drama of this. Okay, so that this is a possibility that the shocks may actually be fatal to some level to a person who has a heart problem. But of course, the experimenter kind of plays this down by saying, look, it'll be extremely painful, but it won't cause permanent damage. Now, of course, this experiment is very well organized. And what we can do is we can kind of set up a script for the person who is the learner. Okay, in this particular case, we also know that it was being recorded, and so therefore every participant hears the same thing. But this is also very cunning. We have 3 levels of shocks here. So the first level, kind of relatively low. Still, I don't really want to get a shock of 120 volts. The participant kind of hears the learner saying, this is quite painful, kind of, I don't want to do this anymore. But we see kind of taking like 8th, 9th type of level of shock, the person is referring to heart trouble. So we can't kind of then go back and say, oh, but actually they only mentioned the heart trouble right near the end. This is really important that we see even early on. So even after 300 volts, they've got 315, 330, 345. There's still at least a significant amount of shocks to go before they come to an end. But we also know that they start saying, look, I no longer want to take part of this experiment. And we finally have kind of banging on the wall saying, that's it, I'm not going to answer anymore. And of course, what happens, they get told that if they don't give a response, that they say an absence of the response is going to be treated as a wrong answer. So we can control exactly the script of the learner. We can control effectively the script of the experimenter in terms of setting up the experiment, but what we can't control is how the participant responds. So Milgram thinks up kind of levels of responses that the experimenter can give. You can see that there are kind of 4 levels of threat, so to speak, from please continue all the way through to you have no choice. Now, this is kind of very easy to kind of understand. So if the person says, no, I want to stop, and all the experimenter simply says, please continue, and then, of course, they go back to the experiment. We know that prod 1 has worked and I don't need to move to prod 2. It's kind of like punishing a child or kind of threatening a child. If you don't do this, I'm going to do that. So if you don't listen to me, you're not going to get to go and play with your friend. And then they listen to you. So therefore, you don't need to go to the next level of punishment. But of course, in terms of the experiment, we do kind of see that we can't really control this, because it could be that the person is arguing, saying, look, I don't want to do this, but then the person says it's absolutely essential, and the person continues. And so therefore, we've got to kind of take it as it comes. And you can see this from the video footage that we've watched. Now, before we look at the findings, I suppose the most important thing we need to kind of recognize is that Milgram wasn't sure what was going to happen, but he did ask people. This is very kind of common within schools, common within experimentation. What do you think will happen? And of course, this is called presumptive consent, and we can talk about that when we look at the ethics. But what is really interesting is what I've highlighted and read there. There's a unanimous kind of agreement that people would not go beyond 150 volts, that they would have to be sick or kind of potentially, psychotic in order to kind of go beyond that. So therefore, when we look at the findings, we would consider this idea of people's expectations. And people's expectations were quite clear. Participants would not go to 150 volts. So here we have 3 kind of very simple outcomes. The first one is that 65%, that's 26 out of 40, went all the way to 450 volts. That's a significant amount. But of course, for me, what I find a lot more alarming is the second bullet point here. All participants going to 300 volts. So therefore, nobody can turn back and say, oh yeah, I was the good one, I stopped. Well, actually, how many shocks did you actually give before you stopped? We know at this particular point that 5 participants stopped, leaving 9 more to stop somewhere between 300 volts and 450 volts. And so therefore, it's kind of not important that kind of when they stopped, but at the fact that they didn't get to 450 volts. We then also know that there's other things, collective is called qualitative data. So anything that's to do with words or writing or kind of interviews and stuff like that. So qualitative data. And we see the key here is that the participants were arguing. So this is in itself an interesting kind of outcome, that people weren't just keen to give more shocks and to continue being kind of free to shock as much as they want. They were kind of saying, no, I don't want to do this. And we see that 3 of the participants had uncontrollable seizures, kind of showing kind of, that this is definitely quite serious, isn't it? So this is where things get serious, because Milgram from this is able to make certain conclusions. And it's possibly these conclusions that make him really unpopular. And he's in line with what Ash was talking about, and they're called situational factors. And I've spoken to them before. But in terms of obedience, this becomes quite important, because it's actually saying that evil or things done by bad people are not necessarily bad people. It could be, so that's what dispositional factors are. Disposition is kind of who we are as people. It's not because of who they are. So why is this significant? Well, I said he was a Jew. And of course, what he's ultimately saying is that the Nazis, the people who killed 6 million Jews, weren't necessarily bad, evil people. They were people who were literally no different from us. And maybe the explanation that they were giving in Nuremberg trials, that they're simply following orders, may be true. But this made him very unpopular. And of course, potentially is kind of why we find that Milgram both becomes famous, but also notorious at the same time. So moving on from here, we can look at, okay, let's look at this experiment. Is there something about it that we could be critical of? Now, the first thing we have is a weakness. Now, also I'm hoping at this particular stage, you can see a similarity between this evaluation point and a point I made for Zimbardo. And that is about lacking internal validity, because we have to always look at a lab experiment and talk about reality. Okay, the people may not have believed that they were giving real shocks. Now, of course, this is speculation. I can't go back and kind of find out. But of course, I have two pieces of information to kind of add to this particular evaluation point. The first one is Orn and Holland kind of looked at kind of what the participants were actually being asked to do. And he said that they were giving a near factor shock for trivial reasons. Now, you might not be familiar with the word trivial. You might have seen it in a game called Trivial Pursuit. So trivial is insignificant or small. And so what we see here is that participants were potentially asked to kill somebody for getting a question wrong. Now, of course, this is alarming, because how would you potentially respond if I say, okay, we're going to have a quiz now, and if you get a question wrong, I'm going to cut off a finger? You kind of say, well, that's ridiculous. How can you do that? It's just a question. If I get it wrong, I'll kind of learn from mistakes, those type of things. And that's what they're asked to do. So Orn and Holland actually said it was like a magic show where people simply suspend their own judgment. So I know when I watch a magic show and somebody gets cut in half, that they're not really getting cut in half. I'm really sorry, that's a spoiler for you, but I can kind of go, okay, let's get into the mood of kind of what I'm watching and what I'm experiencing and things like that, and kind of believe what I can see for now. And the same type of thing for the participants, that they're just kind of taking part in this kind of magic show. We also know that there's a wonderful person called Gina Perry who's written some excellent books, and she has a book called Beyond the Shock Machine, where she kind of finds kind of participants and they kind of say, look, they had their own kind of doubts about it at the time. Now, this is hard to verify. She's not writing an academic book or anything. And of course, the participants may just simply be embarrassed that they actually went all the way to 450 volts, and therefore are just saying, yeah, they didn't believe it or not. So generally speaking, we do have a point that participants may have believed that it wasn't real. Though, of course, I do have a comeback. I have a however. A comeback comes from Milgram. And Milgram says, well, hang on. Let's look at these participants. Let's look at the distress that they were experiencing. We know that 3 of them had kind of seizures. So if they didn't think it was real, why are they kind of getting so worked up about it? And of course, this is a contained evaluation point, which we can kind of put together as it is. But I'm going to add one extra thing to this. I'm going to add a furthermore point. And usually when I use furthermore points, it's because what I'm doing is just literally saying there's something else I want to add to this. And in this particular case, it's a kind of very interesting research by Sheridan and King, who literally repeated the Milgram type experiment, but instead of having a human being as the learner, they had a dog. A puppy was getting issued with real shocks. This is the key here, real electric shocks. Now, I do also know that they weren't shocking it all the way to 450 volts. They were just giving it a small shock. But on the puppy, they would have been whining, they would have been crying, and the distress on the puppy's face would have been real. So therefore, the participant would have actually known that they're actually hurting the puppy. And yet we find quite a significant level of obedience. Okay, so therefore, they are still clicking the buttons up to 450 volts. But of course, it's real. Now, don't get worked up between the 54% males and 100% females. It's likely, looking at 1972, it's about kind of the authority figure, and the men might have felt that they could challenge the authority. But still, we see that people do give kind of real shocks. So it is possible that actually Milgram's research does show us about the internal validity, that people do tend to give electric shocks in this particular case. So there we have a weakness that ended up perhaps being questioned. And now we can look at external validity, another genuine concern that we have for any lab experiment. And of course, the shocks might have appeared to be real in the real experiment, but of course, a lab is a lab. So can we look at Milgram's results and say this happens in the real life? Now, Milgram himself says, yes, of course we can. The authority figures that we see in his own lab experiment is very similar to what we find in real life. And in order to kind of back this up, I want to refer to a very famous study by Hoffling. This was done with real nurses in a real hospital and people kind of working real shifts. Now, there's a lot more to this study than perhaps I'm going to use. And I'm also not saying anything negative about nurses. Nurses, in fact, often learn about this particular study in order to kind of help them to be better nurses. But at the time, certainly in 1966, with a real nurse on duty, they get a phone call. And it's an unfamiliar doctor who says, I'm Dr. Smith, and I want you to give 20 milligrams of a drug to a particular patient. Now, of course, this is not allowed. They have to have written authorization to do this. And of course, it's an unfamiliar doctor. But of course, to make matters even more complicated is we know that 20 milligrams would be a fatal dose because the maximum is 10 milligrams. And so we put ourselves into a situation where we have an authority figure telling these nurses that they need to do this. Okay, you can make up some kind of excuse about running late, you'll come and sign the papers later, whatever it is, they get the same story. Of course, when Hoffling went to nurses and said, what do you think they're going to do? They quite rightly said, no, of course we'd never do that because that would be kind of wrong and we wouldn't kind of break the rules. But the sad reality is that 21 out of 22 would have obeyed if they weren't stopped. And so maybe we are socialized into obedience. If we look at those nurses, kind of knowing the consequences of disobedience to a doctor, how awkward their lives would have been and how difficult things would have been for them if they didn't obey. So we could say that actually maybe Milgram's study does demonstrate what happens in the real life settings, and certainly Hoffling can back that up. So there we go. I've had to record this several times. I'm hoping that this particular recording is good and that you have learned a bit about Milgram. In the next kind of video, I'm going to be looking at some of the ethical issues, and then following on from that, I'm going to look at some of the variables affecting Milgram. Okay, thank you.